Thank you very much. I'm going to speak in English. So all of those of you who don't want to listen to English, which I would understand very well, don't need to stay, but I think there are wonderful translators who've translated for me before, and so I know that everything I say will come out much, much better in the translation. So, what I want to discuss with you today is the issue of what we should think about the possibility of creating not just artificial intelligence, we already have that, for all sorts of reasons. Most of you will be carrying more power of intelligence in your laptops or in your phones than existed when I was a student, and more computing power and artificial intelligence power than existed in the entire world when I was a student. But I'm going to talk to you about super AI, super artificial intelligence. That is the possibility of creating artificial intelligence equal to or superior to the intelligence that you and I share. This possibility raises many fears, but also many opportunities. And the business of people like me is to try to help myself and others decide whether we should welcome these possibilities or whether we should reject them. So this is a very important question for all of us, for our societies, and for the world. There are also, just to footnote, some other currents that are important to think about. If it were possible to create artificial intelligence comparable to ours, then they would be people like us. Not like us, and I'll come to this later in my talk, not like us because they were flesh and blood, and that may be one of the problems, but like us in the sense that they would be able to think for themselves, make decisions for themselves, to create their own lives according to their own desires, just as I hope you and I are able to do. So they would have rights, and they would have to have legal status. And the world would change in very, very many ways. This, of course, and I haven't even started my talk yet, this, of course, may also apply to animals. And it's just important to have this in mind. We are now able to use gene editing techniques to introduce human cells into animals. There are many reasons why we might do this, and one of them, which is the brainchild of George Church, who is a professor of all of this stuff, of embryology in animals at Harvard. He has suggested that we could, by introducing human cells into pigs, grow human organs for transplant in pigs, and that we could use something you'll hear about from Elena Catania tonight if you come to the lecture at 9. We could use the technique known as CRISPR, CRISPR-Cas9 in particular, to clean these organs grown in pigs so that they would be safer for transplants than human-to-human transplant. Actually safer. This might remove entirely the scarcity of human donor organs, which costs hundreds of thousands of lives per year in the world. But here's where it connects with artificial intelligence. The cells that you might introduce, which would specialize as heart cells in the pig, might also migrate to the pig's brain and start creating human brain capacities in the pig? If so, it would create the same problems if they managed to develop brains comparable to ours as we have with artificial intelligence. They would begin to have purposes and aspirations of their own and require to be given moral and legal status, just like us, just like you and me. So that is the digression. I will now return to the topic of artificial intelligence. We humans yes, we're back, good. We humans are incurably curious creatures. That has enabled us not only to develop, but to develop science and engineering and biotechnology and everything. We are curious creatures. That curiosity is likely also to be shared by machines with artificial intelligence. Let me just give you one powerful set of reasons as to why there are good reasons to be hopeful for the prospects of artificial intelligence, as well as to fear what might happen. Let me give you first the good reasons to be hopeful. I want to offer you two truths, two true things, two true facts about the future. Now, it's a reckless person, as you know, who attempts to offer true facts about the future. But I think these are as true as any facts about the future can be. And they are these. And whether you will find them comforting or disturbing is an interesting question. In the future, there will be no more human beings, and there will be no more planet Earth. Those are the two true facts that we have to consider about the future. Why will there be no more human beings? Well, the bad reason is that our foolishness and recklessness with the environment, with technology, and in every other way may have brought about our own extinction. But even if that does not happen, we are going to further evolve. And we need to, for the second reason, which I will come back to, we need to further evolve because we have to get smarter. So, in the future there will be no more planet Earth, and this is why we have to get smarter. Originally, the estimate for the period at which our sun would make the Earth uninhabitable was, I think, calculated actually by Stephen Hawking, and he estimated some years ago that in 7.6 billion years, 7.6 thousand million years, the Earth would become uninhabitable. Well, you might think, I don't really have to worry about that for a few years yet. But he has recently revised his estimate. And just last year he said, and I quote, "I don't think we," that is the Earth, "will survive another 1,000 years. And we humans would have to escape this fragile planet before that happens." And Martin Rees, who was the we have these very quaint titles in England, the Astronomer Royal. That means he was appointed by the Queen to be her chief astronomer, and he was also president of our Royal Society, which is our National Academy for Science. He wrote a book 2 years ago, oh, a few more than that, 3 or 4 years ago, called Our Final Century, in which he speculated, for very good reasons, that this 100 years, the next 100 years, might be our last, unless we manage to cope with the problems that face us. So for those 2 reasons, speculative as they are, but ultimately, if we're not careful, fatal to us and our planet, we need to get smarter. Now the problem is, of course, that genetic evolution, Darwinian evolution, takes a hell of a long time. It's taken billions of years for us to evolve from our ape ancestors. We can't wait that long. So we have to accelerate the process of evolution in order to ensure our own survival. It's a matter of survival. So one reason that we might want to create artificial intelligence is to expedite that process, to help us manage that process. Another reason is that, again, this is a thought from Martin Rees, very famous scientist in the UK. He speculates, and this can only be a speculation, that there are scientific facts that beings whose brains have evolved in the way that ours have simply cannot understand. And there are scientific theories that we could not even postulate because of the evolutionary history of the sorts of brains that we have. Now, if we can create artificial brains, artificial intelligence, then they may be able to see dangers that we don't even see and help us and them face those dangers. We don't know how real these possibilities are, but it is important to think about them before it's too late. And what's too late? Well, maybe 7.6 billion years, maybe just 1,000 years, maybe, as Martin Rees said recently, just 100 years. There's another problem too, which has recently focused itself. We are emerging, I'm sure you've all noticed this, into what has been called a post-truth world, a fantasy world, a Donald Trump world of lies and alternative facts. In such a world, the problems that face us become acute. How can there be genuine choices informed by evidence and argument in a post-truth environment? I wonder whether either Hawking or Rees anticipated Donald Trump's election, or indeed the lies that led my country very recently to vote for Brexit. An absolute disaster for us, and I don't think too wonderful for Europe either, but certainly not very good for the United Kingdom. So, we need to make ourselves smarter, more resilient, and more aware that honesty, truth, and objectivity are not optional extras. They are necessary for our survival. And we may need, eventually, quite soon, to call on super artificial intelligence to help achieve our survival. Now we come to a very important question. How can we ensure that if we create artificial intelligence, we can control it, or at least prevent it from controlling us in ways that we would not wish, or prevent them from controlling us in ways that we wouldn't like. Now, some have thought this is not too difficult a problem. The science fiction writer Isaac Asimov, many years ago now, created some laws of robotics, that if we built these laws into the programming of artificial intelligence, would keep us safe. And they're all of these laws are really a version of the first law. And I quote from Asimov, a robot will be programmed with this, as it were, constraint. A robot may not injure a human being, or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. The problem, of course, with these laws of robotics is even if the robot had all the goodwill, all of the morality that we would hope, how would it obey such a commandment? How do we obey such a commandment with respect to one another? The problem, of course, is that most moral choices are not choices between doing harm and not doing harm, hurting other people and not hurting other people. They are choices between lesser and greater evils, lesser and greater harms. To take a simple example, if there is a natural catastrophe, rescue services are overstretched. They have to choose who to save first. And that may mean that the people lower down the list don't get saved at all. So it's not a simple thing, simply to avoid acting or omitting to act in a way that avoids harm to others. We often have to choose between harms. And so the programming, we would hope, cannot possibly work. So the question, the very difficult question to which we don't know the answer, is how to combine the capacity for good, which all human beings share, with the freedom to choose. And I think this is what Stephen Hawking had in mind when he said in 2014, and I quote, "The primitive forms of artificial intelligence we already have proved very useful. But I think the development of full artificial intelligence," and by that he meant artificial intelligence comparable to ours, "the development of full artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race." End quote. So the question then is, how might AI persons, artificially intelligent persons, who could determine their own destiny, as we humans do, be persuaded to choose modes of existence, modes of flourishing for themselves, which are compatible with the modes of flourishing that we need in order to flourish? And this may be very problematic indeed. Now, of course, we have these problems with respect to one another, but we share a common nature. We share what is sometimes called human nature. I'll come back to that in a minute, but a lot of it depends on us being creatures of a certain sort, flesh and blood creatures who are born and who die, who reproduce, and who have reasons to cooperate with one another, and who know what it is like to enjoy life and who know what it is like to suffer, because we share a common nature. I'll come back to that at the end of my talk. But that may not be true of artificial intelligence. They may not be flesh and blood at all. They may not reproduce by sexual reproduction as we do. They may reproduce by mechanical construction. They may not feel cold. They may not feel passion. They may not feel love. They may be very different. Their modes of flourishing, what they think of as a good time, may not be what we think of as a good time. And what they think of as a bad time may not be what we think of as a bad time for them. Somewhere, a long time ago now, somewhere before 1985, I know when it was because I first wrote about it in a book that I published in 1985. Somewhere before that time, I started to think seriously about how we humans and artificial intelligence might react to one another. And at that time, I explored the possibility by a thought experiment, sort of experiments we philosophers do. Some of you may have taken part in scientific experiments. We philosophers, I always say this to the vice chancellor or the president of any university I've ever been a member of, we're very cheap to employ because we don't need labs. We don't need equipment. We don't need hundreds of mice to kill or not to kill. That is the question. We just sit in an armchair and think. It's fantastic. So we're really good, cost-effective, good value for money. However, this is not always a persuasive argument. And this is what I said in 1985. The question of whether or not there are people on other planets is a real one. If there are, we need not expect them to be flesh and blood creatures like ourselves. We don't know what they will be like. They may not look or sound or smell or anything else like us. And they might not even be organic, flesh and blood. They might reproduce, as I say, by mechanical construction rather than genetic reproduction. And I then went on to make this speculation, which I want to share with you now. We don't know whether there are people on other planets, but it's very probable that there are in a universe as vast as ours. If, instead of us going into deep space and finding them, they come into near space and find us, thereby demonstrating their superior technology. And lots of films about this, including a recent one, Arrival, which some of you may have seen. Suppose they find us rather than we finding them. What could we say about ourselves that should persuade them that they had found persons on other planets? And by that I mean morally significant people, people whose lives matter, people who they should treat, hopefully, as equals and with moral consideration. What could we say about ourselves that should persuade them when they arrive after their huge intergalactic journey from star systems billions of light years from here? And let us suppose that, like us, they share a few not very pleasant traits. They get tired and they get irritable, and they get hungry, or whatever passes for hungry. So they turn up on our planet, tired, irritable, and hungry. What can we say about ourselves that should persuade them that it would be appropriate to invite us to lunch rather than having us for lunch? What could we say about ourselves? What would we have to be like? In short, what could we say that should convince them that they had found persons on other planets, persons of a particular morally important kind, whose fate, whose ambitions, whose hopes and fears matter? We talk naturally of life forms, but as I said, an AI person, alien or machine, might not be strictly alive in the sense that we are at all. It might be functionally immortal. It might be made of durable parts that it could replicate mechanically by engineering, and as they wore out, it would just plug in new bits and pieces. which unfortunately, although we can do that a little, we can't do it very effectively as yet. One thing it's likely to have, any AI is likely to have in common with us, is a desire to survive. Either by replication, like we do by sexual reproduction, by creating successors, not ourselves, but like ourselves, sharing our genes, sharing elements of our nature, or by creating successor selves in a different way, either by repairing themselves so often that they literally become a different person over very long periods of time. And here, and this is the final point I want to make before hopefully you will have some questions and comments, I want to go back to the sort of nature that we have. Some of you will be familiar with this. One of my trademarks is that I usually, what I write and what I say, I haven't given you too much of that. I like to quote from many literary and artistic sources, usually Shakespeare, but sometimes other writers, even Italians, I've been known to quote from. Dante and Giuseppe di Lampedusa among them. But today I want to remind you of the famous speech in Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, the famous speech that Shylock, the Jewish merchant of Venice, says when he's trying to explain that he, a Jew, is relevantly comparable to the other merchants of Venice who are Christians. And he ends his famous speech with these words about him as a Jew. If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And many people forget or omit this last line. And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? Now those set out elements of a particular nature common to everyone in this room and everyone that we know. And we can respond to that nature. It makes an appeal, the very appeal that Shylock makes. We make that appeal, that is the moral appeal that we make to all others, other humans. I'm like you. I have hopes, fears, all of that stuff. But what would we say to a creature who wasn't like us in any relevant ways? I want to end with this quotation from a philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein. He has a very famous and very sophic remark, very poetic remark. And he says in his wonderful book, The Philosophical Investigation, he just asks this question and leaves it lying on the table. He says, if a lion could speak, we could not understand him. Now, why did he say that? And one of the most, certainly my interpretation, and one of the most commonly accepted interpretations of that remark, is that the way of life of a lion, moda di vita of a lion, would be so different to ours that we wouldn't understand why it wanted to live and do and behave in the ways that it did. We need to have a shared, well, a shared what? It doesn't really matter what. We need to have a shared mode of existence and nature. For us, it is our shared evolutionary past, which has made us the sorts of creatures we are. For an AI, it would be very different. For an alien, it might be very different. And perhaps it was to acquire, and of course the gods, we're all familiar with gods, whether we are believers, which I am not, or whether we are believers, we're very familiar with the notion, the concept of a god or gods. Now, gods, actually, in our traditions, in all of our traditions, are very different, to a certain extent, to humans. One of the differences, of course, is that they're immortal, or allegedly immortal, and we are mortal. In fact, sometimes humans are defined as mortals to distinguish us from gods, or the immortals, who are not. And perhaps it was for this reason that in many religious and cultural traditions, the gods seem to go out of their way to find out about us, maybe so that they could understand us better. And they used to come down to earth from Olympus, if they were Greek gods, and relate to humans in all sorts of ways. Assist us in battles. They seem to have a predilection for human women as well, lots of sex with humans. And perhaps it was for this reason that the gods did interfere so very frequently in human life, actually to understand our nature in a way that we would find it difficult to understand the nature of a lion. Let me return to a point I made earlier, and this is the final remark I want to make. As I said earlier, we humans share, among all the other things that we like to do, we share a pretty universal desire to better ourselves, to improve ourselves, and make ourselves better in every sense of that word. Better morally, better physically, more durable, longer lived, more inventive, and so on. The most urgent and worrying ethical problems surrounding the uses of any new technology, including AI, are not, I believe, the dangers of pursuing the research, despite what Stephen Hawking and others have said, but the dangers of not pursuing the research, at least to the point where we understand better whether or not it's controllable and whether or not it is in our interests as well as in the interests of creatures like us. And this is why, as I've mentioned before, I am very worried, more worried than I am about artificial intelligence or any other, or gene editing, or any other technologies with which we are familiar. I'm more worried about the current disregard for science, for truth, and for honesty in human affairs. It seems to me that we must pursue research, including research into AI, to the point at which we can realistically assess its potential for both good and ill. This is, of course, to tread a moral and scientific tightrope, but the alternative, I think, to scientific optimism is even more bleak. It means that we give up on the possibility of protecting ourselves from the two facts about the future that I mentioned earlier, that in the future there will be no more human beings and no more planet Earth. If we can make ourselves or other things that are smart enough to ensure not only our physical survival or that of our successors, but to create through science, the ability either to find another world on which to live when this one gives up on us, or maybe even to have the technology to create another world on which we can live. Thank you very much. And may I also thank the translators so far, because I've strayed very much from the text that I showed them, but they, just by their smiles, I could tell that they were keeping up very well. Ci sono domande? Sir. Oh, please. Hold on. If you ask it in English, do it through my microphone.
Okay. Thank you. So thank you very much for your talk. My question is this. So how can our argument to this intergalactic beings be persuasive if we cannot live by the same arguments with respect to the respect of other billions of beings that obviously have a desire to survive, like non-human animals. So a reply of these intergalactic beings might be, why should we be persuaded by your arguments if you cannot live by it by yourself?
A good question, and one that it is embarrassingly impossible to answer in a convincing way for the very reasons that you asked the question. But I'm an optimist about human nature. That may show how little I am, my philosophy is to be relied upon, but I am an optimist about human nature. There has been moral progress. There continues to be moral progress. Most of us are a little bit ashamed of the way we treat some other humans. Some of us are a little bit ashamed of the way we treat non-human sentient creatures like animals. And I think this is a very complicated question. I think that morality is objective. That is to say, I think we all understand well the difference between good and evil, and the reason we understand it well, which is why I'm a little bit worried about artificial intelligence, is because we share a common nature, is because we all bleed if we are pricked, we all die if we are poisoned, we all feel like revenge if somebody does wrong to us or those that we love. And we have been reasonably good at recognizing and enlarging the group of people or things to which we believe we have moral obligations. In the very recent past, to our shame in our evolutionary history, but nonetheless, in the very recent past, slavery has been at least officially abolished everywhere, though of course it continues to exist. Equal rights are accorded to all citizens, regardless of the usual arbitrary characteristics, race, gender, and so on. Not age, interestingly, not developmental stages, but there may be other reasons why we need to hang on at least to some of those. So I'm an optimist about us. At least we know when we're acting badly, most of the time, and are ashamed of ourselves most of the time. And the treatment of refugees is another one, and I have to say that Italy's record in this has been particularly good in global terms and in European terms, and I think Italy is to be much admired for the way that it has welcomed refugees in a way that few other countries in Europe have done. So there are causes for optimism. How we would answer the aliens who were more powerful than us, or the artificial intelligences that we created who are more powerful than us, when they say, well, you're not so good yourselves, you know. Why should I care about you when you don't care about one another? And the answer is, well, because hopefully we're trying. And we have, I believe we have made progress. I think the world is more dangerous now because there are more dangers, but it is also a much more tolerant, generally, place. And most countries and most individuals recognize when they're doing wrong, and most, at least, try to do something about it. But we have to do more. So yes, your question continues to embarrass not only me, but all human beings. And the fact that it embarrasses us gives me reason for hope. Any other? It's so wonderful to have been so universally convincing. Yes. I'm assuming you're going to ask the question. Well, either way, we'll need the microphone.
Thank you. How can men be so sure about the fact that he's going to control and he's going to prevent artificial intelligence just by creating it? I can't understand how this conviction can be and so sure and so strong.
I hope I didn't give that. I don't think we can control it any more than we can control one another, except by, well, by the usual means, threats and promises. We either threaten people with various sorts of revenge, a la Shylock, if they do wrong, or we give them incentives to do right. We appeal to their better nature, if they have one. And that's why I asked the question, what would we say about ourselves that ought to convince more powerful aliens that we were worth saving and coexisting with rather than dominating and exploiting? And that's where the earlier question becomes very relevant. You know, we haven't demonstrated that wonderfully, but we, I think, have made improvements. And I think because we can't rely on control, because we can't rely on Asimov-style laws of robotics, we either have to be as careful as we can not to create intelligences that are uncontrollable, or if we must, and I think it may be that we must, hopefully giving them reasons to care for us as well as for themselves. And if they were flesh and blood creatures, I'd be more confident that we could do that, because we know what turns us on and turns us off. We would be much less likely to know that about artificially intelligent creatures. In an otherwise unreadable book, Nick Bostrom of Oxford has written about artificial intelligence. I mean, it's a very clever book, but it's not easy to read. But he imagines an artificial intelligence that just decided to set itself a goal. And a lot of human beings have rather bizarre ambitions and goals and things they want to do. It just wanted to manufacture paperclips endlessly. And, you know, and it was so turned on by this idea that it just created more and more paperclips until the world was full of paperclips and there wasn't room for creatures like us. And the question is, for creatures whose desires we cannot even understand, let alone hope to control, then I think it would be very difficult to be confident that we would have the persuasive powers that would trigger the things that we use to persuade one another. We appeal to the commonality derived from our evolutionary past. That's why it's very dangerous, but the alternative may be more dangerous, and sometimes you just have to take a calculated risk, and I think we, at the moment, don't know how to calculate the risk, so we have to go cautiously. But ultimately, I think we will have to take a calculated risk on AI, because it will prove too useful to forego. But I could be wrong about that, like I could be wrong about absolutely anything. Any other points that people wish to raise? It doesn't have to be a question, it can be a speech, criticism, whatever. I think people want to go and have a coffee, which is entirely understandable because we are the sorts of creatures that like to go and have a coffee. So perhaps that's what we should do.
Nessuno? Grazie professore, veramente grazie.